What if the two frail, elderly convicts shuffling out of the prison gates, the ones the world has utterly forgotten, were not merely prisoners? What if they were kings in exile, their thrones left vacant for 3 long decades, waiting for fate to play its final, decisive hand? The iron gate groaned shut behind Arthur and Eleanor Vance, a sound of finality that echoed with the 30 years it had swallowed. The sunlight was a physical blow, too bright, too loud, after a lifetime spent in the muted gray of concrete and steel. Arthur, at 78, leaned heavily on a cane, his prison-issued shoes scuffed against the unfamiliar asphalt. His hands, knotted with arthritis, trembled slightly, but his eyes, deep-set in a face carved by time and hardship, missed nothing. Beside him, Eleanor, a year his junior, stood with a deceptive stillness. Her back was stooped, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, but her gaze was as sharp and discerning as it had been the day they walked in. They were ghosts in a world that had raced ahead without them. Cars moved with a silent, predatory swiftness. People stared into glowing rectangles in their hands, their faces illuminated by an invisible world. 30 years. An entire generation had been born, had grown, and had begun to age in the time they had been erased. Their possessions fit into a single cardboard box, which a bored guard had shoved into Arthur's arms. A few faded books, worn-out clothes that smelled of institutional soap, and a stack of letters tied with a string. Nothing of value. Nothing to hint at the life they had lived before. A sleek, dark car pulled up to the curb, and a young man in a suit that looked too expensive for his age stepped out. This was Garrett Finch, their parole officer. He had the smooth, unlined face of someone who had never known a day of real struggle, and his eyes, a cold, dismissive blue, swept over them as if they were stains on the pavement. "Arthur and Eleanor Vance," he said, his voice clipped, impatient. "It wasn't a question. Let's get a move on. I don't have all day." He didn't offer to help with the box. He simply turned and got back into the driver's seat, expecting them to follow. Arthur and Eleanor exchanged a look. It was a language they had perfected over 50 years of marriage, 30 of them spent in separate wings of the same prison, their communication reduced to censored letters and brief, supervised visits. In that single glance, a universe of understanding passed between them, patience, resolve, and a shared memory of a time when men like Garrett Finch would not have dared to breathe in their presence without permission. Slowly, they made their way to the car. Eleanor opened the back door for Arthur, her movements deliberate and careful. He settled himself with a quiet groan, the box resting on his lap. The world outside the car window was a dizzying blur of color and speed. Finch drove with aggressive confidence, tapping at the screen embedded in his dashboard. "Things have changed," he announced, not looking at them. "You'll find you don't fit in. My job is to make sure you don't cause any trouble while you fade away. You'll be at the Northwood Transitional Facility. It's clean. Barely. You'll have a curfew, mandatory check-ins, and I'll be drug testing you weekly. Any violation, any at all, and you're back inside so fast your heads will spin. Understand?" Arthur's voice was raspy from disuse, a low rumble. "We understand." Finch glanced at him in the rearview mirror, a smirk playing on his lips. "Good. Just a couple of old relics. That's what you are. Best you remember that." He saw 2 withered, defeated convicts. He had no idea he was chauffeuring the architects, the 2 individuals whose quiet whispers had once built and shattered fortunes, the master strategists of a world he couldn't even imagine. The world had forgotten them, and that, for now, was their greatest strength. The halfway house smelled of bleach and despair. It was a place for endings, for people spat out by the system with nowhere else to go. Finch marched them to a small room on the 2nd floor, containing 2 narrow cots, a single dresser, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. "Home sweet home," he sneered, dropping a folder of paperwork onto one of the beds. "All the rules are in there. I want you to read them, memorize them, and then read them again. Your first check-in is tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. And just so we're clear, I know your case file. Financial conspiracy, fraud on a massive scale. The courts never found the money. If you think you have some nest eggs stashed away, forget it. I'll be watching every penny you get, every move you make. That money is gone. Just like your lives. He closed the door, and the lock clicked with a sound of grim familiarity. For a long moment, Arthur and Eleanor stood in silence, the quiet of the room a stark contrast to the constant noise of prison. Then, Eleanor walked to the window and touched the cool glass. He sees what he wants to see, she said, her voice soft but clear, holding the same unwavering strength it always had. Arthur placed the box on the floor and slowly lowered himself onto the edge of the cot. He opened it, his gnarled fingers carefully lifting out the contents. The books. The letters from their granddaughter, Chloe. And at the very bottom, a worn photograph in a cheap plastic frame. It showed a young woman with Eleanor's eyes, holding a swaddled infant. Their daughter, Sarah, just before everything had fallen apart. Sarah was gone, taken by a sudden illness a decade into their sentence. But the baby in her arms, Chloe, was their reason for enduring. She was the future they had sacrificed everything to protect. He's a boy, Eleanor, Arthur said, his gaze distant. A boy playing with a grown-up's toys. He doesn't understand the rules of the game. Eleanor turned from the window, a faint, sad smile on her lips. Then we will have to teach him. She knelt beside Arthur, her hand resting on his. Together, they began to unpack, not just the contents of the box, but the carefully preserved memories of who they truly were. Later that evening, as the city hummed outside their grimy window, Arthur tipped the cardboard box over. It was empty, save for a few specks of dust. But he wasn't looking inside. He ran his fingers along the bottom, feeling for a slight ridge in the cheap cardboard. His fingers found it, a piece of clear, industrial tape, yellowed with age. Carefully, he peeled it back. Taped flat against the bottom was a small, ornate key, its metal a dull, tarnished brass. It was thin, almost delicate, and utterly out of place. Finch, in his arrogant haste, had missed it entirely. Arthur closed his hand around it, the cool metal a familiar weight in his palm. He looked at Eleanor, and she nodded. The first move had been made 30 years ago. Now, it was time for the second. Their first supervised visit with Chloe was in a sterile, joyless room at the parole office. Finch sat at a desk in the corner, pretending to do paperwork but watching their every move. Chloe, now 24, rushed to them the moment they entered. She was a beautiful young woman, with her mother's kind eyes and a strength that shone through her weary expression. She hugged them tightly, burying her face in Arthur's shoulder. "Grandpa. Grandma. I can't believe it." For 30 years, she had known them only through letters and the thick glass of a visitor's booth. To finally touch them, to feel their arms around her, was a miracle. She had brought them a bag with new clothes, simple, comfortable things, and an envelope containing a few $100s. "It's not much," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been saving up. For you." Arthur held her hands, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "It is everything, my dear. Everything." He saw the faint dark circles under her eyes, the worn look of her coat. Life was not easy for her. Eleanor smoothed a stray strand of hair from Chloe's forehead. "Tell us about your work, child. About your apartment." Chloe's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered it. "It's all fine. I'm a barista, the hours are long but the people are nice. And the apartment is, well, it's a roof over my head." She didn't mention the landlord who was trying to force her out, raising the rent illegally and ignoring her requests for repairs. She didn't want to burden them. But Arthur and Eleanor saw it all. They had spent a lifetime reading the subtle tells people hide behind their words. In the corner, Finch cleared his throat loudly. "Time's up. 15 minutes. Let's go." The abruptness was cruel, designed to assert his power. Chloe's face fell, but she hugged them one last time, promising to see them again as soon as she was allowed. "I love you both so much." As she left, Finch walked them to the door. "Touching little reunion," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't get used to it. Privileges like that are earned. And they can be taken away." Arthur's hand, resting on his cane, tightened until his knuckles were white. A cold, precise anger, dormant for 3 decades, flickered deep within him. Finch saw only a frail old man. He did not see the architect calculating the precise stress points of his insignificant life. That night, back in their small room, Eleanor laid out the letters from Chloe, years of them, in chronological order on her cot. She didn't read them. Instead, she pointed to a single word in a letter from 5 years ago. Then another word in a letter from 2 years ago. And a third from a letter received last month. "The North Star," she said softly. Arthur nodded, his mind already working. It was their code, one they had established in the first year of their incarceration, a simple cipher hidden in plain sight, built on shared memories and phrases only they would understand. The North Star was a reference to a small, independent bank they had used long ago, a place that valued discretion above all else. The other word she indicated formed an account number. This was not the vast fortune Finch was obsessed with, that was long gone, sacrificed as part of the plan. This was something else. This was operational capital. Seed money. The next day, Arthur went to a public library. Moving through the modern world was a disorienting experience. He felt slow, ancient, invisible. Teenagers brushed past him without a second glance. He sat at a public computer, his arthritic fingers moving awkwardly over the keyboard. It took him 20 minutes to do what a younger person could have done in 2, but he did it. He accessed the account. The balance was modest, just enough for what they needed. It was clean, untraceable, a ghost account from a ghost bank. He then searched for an address, one that had been committed to memory for 30 years. A storage facility in an old industrial part of the city. A unit rented under a false name, the lease paid in full for 50 years. The contingency. While Arthur was at the library, Eleanor was making her own move. She went to a small charity shop near the halfway house and bought an old, functional cassette player. The young woman at the counter gave her a pitying look. "Wow, retro. My grandpa had one of these." Eleanor simply smiled and paid in cash. Back in their room, they prepared. They were moving with a purpose that had been absent for decades. The stoop in their shoulders seemed less pronounced, the hesitation in their steps replaced by a quiet, inexorable momentum. They were 2 old clocks, long stopped, that had suddenly begun to tick again. The key Arthur had found felt like a promise. The account gave them means. And the address gave them a destination. They knew that whatever was in that storage unit would be the weapon they needed. They were not seeking vengeance for themselves, their own lives were in their final chapter. They were seeking justice for Chloe. They were about to remind the world, and one man in particular, that architects not only build things up, they also know exactly how to tear them down. Their greatest enemy, Alastair Cromwell, had built an empire on their ashes. For 30 years, he had lived a life of unimaginable luxury and power, all while they rotted in a cell. He had been their protégé, their most trusted lieutenant, before he betrayed them, framing them to cover his own vast embezzlement and fraud. They took the fall willingly, a calculated sacrifice to protect their daughter, Sarah, whom Cromwell had cleverly entangled in the scheme, making it seem as if she were the mastermind. By confessing, they had saved her from prosecution, but they had lost everything else. They had assumed Cromwell, having won, would leave their family alone. They had assumed their sacrifice would be enough. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The next check-in with Finch was tense. He had been digging deeper into their case, his greed piqued by the legend of their missing fortune. "Still no secret trips to the Cayman Islands?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, feet on his desk. "Funny. A couple of criminal masterminds like you, and you can't even afford a decent pair of shoes." Eleanor's face remained placid. We have all that we need, Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. You have nothing. You are nothing. I've been doing some reading. You two were called the architects. Sounds impressive. But look at you now. A couple of ruins. He dropped his feet to the floor and leaned forward, his voice turning colder. I've also been doing some networking. I have a new consulting gig on the side. Security and risk assessment for a very prestigious firm. Cromwell Industries, he said the name with reverence, watching for a reaction. He got none. Arthur's expression was as still as a frozen lake. Inside, however, a glacier was breaking apart. Cromwell. The name was a ghost, a poison they had carried for 30 years. Mr. Cromwell's company is very interested in legacy threats, Finch continued, enjoying himself. People from the past holding grudges. He pays well for peace of mind. Very well. So if you get any bright ideas, any thoughts of trying to stir up trouble, remember who I'm working for. Remember whose side I'm on. It was a threat, but it was also a fatal mistake. Finch had just confirmed he was a pawn for their greatest enemy. He had aligned himself with the man who had destroyed their lives and, as they would soon discover, was still actively working to destroy what little they had left. He had made himself a target. The bus ride to the storage facility was a journey through a city they no longer recognized. Gleaming towers of glass and steel had replaced the familiar brick and stone buildings of their memory. Everything was faster, louder, more crowded. They looked out of place, two sepia-toned figures in a high-definition world. During the ride, a young mother struggled to get her stroller, heavy with a sleeping toddler and groceries, up the bus steps. The other passengers stared at their phones, ignoring her. Without a word, Arthur rose, his joints protesting, and took the front of the stroller. Eleanor took the back. Together, they carefully lifted it onto the bus. The mother, flustered and grateful, thanked them profusely. Oh, thank you so much. No one ever helps anymore. Eleanor simply patted the woman's arm. It takes a village, she said softly. It was a small moment, a simple act of selfless kindness, but it was the core of who they were. They were protectors. It was the instinct that had led them to sacrifice their freedom for their daughter, and it was the same instinct now driving them toward this final confrontation. The storage facility was a relic from their time, a sprawling complex of rust-colored metal doors under a faded sign. The air smelled of dust and neglect. They found Unit 3B at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The lock was old and stiff, covered in a thick layer of grime. Arthur's trembling hand held the small, tarnished key. For a moment, he paused. This was it. The culmination of a 30-year plan. He inserted the key. It scraped, resisted, and then, with a final, determined push, it slid home. He turned it. The click of the tumblers was deafening in the silence. It was the sound of the past unlocking, of fate turning its final page. He pulled the heavy metal door upwards. It groaned in protest, sending a shower of rust flakes onto the concrete floor. The air that billowed out was stale, dry, and smelled of aging paper. Inside, it was not what one would expect. There was no gold, no cash, no jewels. Instead, the small space was filled with gray, fireproof filing cabinets and metal shelves lined with dozens of sealed document boxes. On a small table in the center sat a vintage, high-quality cassette recorder, the one Eleanor had purchased the player for. This was not a treasure chest. It was an arsenal. It was the complete, unvarnished history of Alistair Cromwell's entire criminal career. Arthur stepped inside, his cane tapping on the floor. He ran a hand over one of the filing cabinets. Everything, he whispered. We kept everything. They had been meticulous. For years before their fall, as they grew suspicious of Cromwell, they had created a shadow ledger, a secret archive of his dealings. Every illegal transaction, every shell corporation, every piece of blackmail, every threat. They had documented it all. The originals, the evidence that would have exonerated them but condemned their daughter, were all here. Eleanor picked up a box labeled Project Nightingale. Inside were audio cassettes. She knew what they were. Recordings of Cromwell's meetings, made with a hidden microphone in a pen Arthur had gifted him. She took one out and brought it to the table. This was the moment of truth. They had assumed their sacrifice would buy their family's safety. They had endured 30 years in that belief. Now, they would find out the price of their faith. Eleanor inserted the tape into the player she'd brought. She pressed play. The hiss of old magnetic tape filled the small room, and then, a voice. Cromwell's voice, younger, but filled with the same arrogant confidence. He was talking to a lawyer. The Vances are gone. They played the martyrs beautifully. Sarah is off limits, which is a shame, but her daughter, the child, is the loose end. We need to control her. Not directly. Subtly. Keep her poor. Keep her struggling. Make sure she never has the resources or the stability to ever look into her grandparents' past. We'll buy the building she lives in through a shell company. We'll make her life a quiet misery. She will be a constant reminder that I won. Arthur's breath hitched. Eleanor closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. The discovery was a shard of ice in their hearts. Their sacrifice had not been enough. Their enemy had not been content with his victory. He had spent the last 2 decades tormenting their granddaughter, the last piece of their legacy. The frail, weary couple who had entered the storage unit vanished. In their place, 2 figures of cold, unyielding resolve stood in the dim light. The stoop in Arthur's back was gone. The gentle softness in Eleanor's eyes had been replaced by polished steel. This was no longer about reclaiming their honor. This was about retribution. This was about tearing Alastair Cromwell's world down to the foundation and salting the earth where it stood. The architects were back to work. Their movements became a symphony of lethal efficiency. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Decades of planning and discipline took over, their minds and bodies remembering the old rhythms. Arthur located a specific ledger, its pages filled with his own precise handwriting, detailing the creation of the shell corporation that Cromwell had used to acquire Chloe's apartment building. It was the smoking gun, directly linking Cromwell to the harassment of their granddaughter. Eleanor, meanwhile, had found the box containing Cromwell's personal insurance files, the blackmail material he held over politicians, judges, and corporate rivals. They had copied it all before their arrest. It was a web of corruption that ensnared half the city's elite. They now had leverage against the very system that had forgotten them. Their plan was simple, elegant, and devastating. It had 2 phases. Phase 1 was the demolition of Cromwell. Phase 2 was the disposal of his pawn, Garrett Finch. Using a payphone at a nearby gas station, an untraceable relic from their own era, Arthur made a call. The number was one he had not dialed in 30 years, but had never forgotten. It belonged to a man named David Chen, once a young, idealistic reporter whose career Arthur had saved from ruin by feeding him a tip that exposed a corrupt city official. Now, Chen was the editor-in-chief of the city's most respected newspaper. "It's been a long time, David," Arthur said, his voice the low growl of a predator. There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Arthur. My God. They said you were. I thought you were dead." "Reports of my demise were premature," Arthur replied coolly. "I need you to listen very carefully. I am about to give you the story of your lifetime. But it comes with conditions. You will publish it all, no redactions. And you will protect my source. The source is my granddaughter." He laid out the instructions for a dead drop, a sample of the evidence to prove its authenticity, the ledger page and one of the more damning audio tapes. Chen, his journalistic instincts screaming, agreed without hesitation. The second call was made by Eleanor. It was to the main switchboard of Cromwell Industries. Using a voice that was frail and confused, she asked to speak to Alastair Cromwell, claiming to be a distant relative. She was, of course, rebuffed by a series of secretaries. But the call was not about reaching Cromwell. It was about creating a digital footprint, a record of an attempted contact from a number that would later be linked to the dead drop, a piece of misdirection to send Cromwell's security teams on a wild goose chase. As they worked, they knew Finch would be a problem. He was their leash, and he was Cromwell's dog. They needed to neutralize him. Arthur recalled Finch's bragging about his consulting work. A parole officer taking money from a convicted felon's former associate was more than a conflict of interest, it was a federal crime. They selected a specific tape from their collection, one in which Cromwell explicitly discussed paying off officials for peace of mind. It didn't name Finch, but it established a pattern. They packaged it with a brief, anonymous typewritten note and mailed it to the Internal Affairs Division of the Justice Department. They were planting a seed that, when the Cromwell story broke, would sprout into a full-blown investigation aimed directly at Finch. They returned to the halfway house just before curfew, two unassuming elderly people melting back into the background. Finch was waiting for them, his arms crossed, his face a mask of fury. "Where have you been? I've been calling you for hours." They had, of course, left their cheap, state-issued cell phones in the room. "We went for a walk," Eleanor said calmly. "The city has changed so much." Finch's eyes narrowed, searching their faces for any sign of deceit. He found none. He saw only two tired, pathetic old convicts. "Don't let it happen again," he snapped, turning on his heel. "I own you. You go where I say, when I say." He walked away, oblivious to the fact that his world, his career, and his freedom were already measured in hours. That night, Arthur and Eleanor didn't sleep. They sat in the dark, the city lights painting patterns on the wall, and they waited for the dawn. They had placed all the pieces on the board. Now, all they had to do was watch the game play out. Fate, after a 30-year delay, was about to deliver its checkmate. The storm broke 2 days later. The headline on David Chen's newspaper was stark, bold, and city-shaking: "The Cromwell Conspiracy, 30 years of fraud, blackmail, and corruption exposed." The story was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, built on the irrefutable evidence Arthur had provided. It detailed the original crimes for which the Vances had been imprisoned, proving their innocence and Cromwell's guilt. But it didn't stop there. It laid bare his entire criminal enterprise, complete with copies of ledger pages, transcripts of audio recordings, and a list of powerful names implicated in his schemes. Cromwell Industries' stock plummeted. Federal agents raided its headquarters before the morning coffee was cold. Alastair Cromwell was arrested while trying to board his private jet, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. The city's elite, named in the article, began turning on each other in a desperate attempt to save themselves. The empire the Vances had been forced to watch their betrayer build was crumbling to dust in a single morning. The fallout reached the Northwood Transitional Facility by noon. Garrett Finch burst into their room without knocking, his face pale with sweat, a newspaper clutched in his hand. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "This is you. It has to be you." Arthur was sitting on his cot, reading a book. He looked up slowly, his expression one of mild curiosity. "I'm not sure I know what you're talking about, son. Don't play dumb with me." Finch screamed, throwing the paper at him. "Cromwell. They arrested him. They're talking about old files, evidence from 30 years ago. Evidence only you could have." Eleanor, who had been standing by the window, turned. Her voice was as cold and quiet as a winter morning. "It seems justice, however slow, arrives eventually. You should be pleased. A great criminal has been caught." "Pleased?" Finch laughed, a hysterical edge to his voice. "They'll investigate everyone connected to him. They'll look at me. My career, my life. You've ruined me." At that moment, two men in dark suits appeared in the doorway. Their badges were clipped to their belts. Federal agents. "Garrett Finch," one of them said, his voice flat and official. "We're from the office of the Inspector General. We need to ask you some questions about your relationship with Alastair Cromwell." Finch's blood ran cold. He looked from the agents to the two elderly people he had mocked and tormented. He saw them clearly for the first time. He saw the intelligence in their eyes, the absolute lack of fear, the cold, calculating certainty. He saw the ruins he had dismissed as irrelevant, and realized they were not ruins at all. They were the architects of his own. As the agents led a stammering, protesting Finch away in handcuffs, he looked back one last time. Arthur met his gaze. He didn't smile. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a confirmation. A closing statement. A final, silent declaration of victory. An hour later, Chloe arrived. She had seen the news. Her face was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, shock, and a dawning, incredible hope. She ran to them, hugging them both. "The news, they said you were innocent. They said that man, Cromwell, he was my landlord. He was the one." Her voice broke. Eleanor held her close. "It's over now, my dear. It's all over." Arthur placed a hand on Chloe's shoulder. For the first time in 30 years, the weight of the world was not on his own. "Your mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we made her a promise. We promised to protect you. It took us a little longer than we expected." The Vances were exonerated in a matter of days. Their convictions were overturned, their names cleared. They were no longer convicts, no longer ghosts. They were heroes, legends whispered about in a city still reeling from the truths they had unearthed. They never touched the fortune Cromwell had stolen, it was all seized by the government. They didn't want it. They had what they had fought for. They had their family, and they had their name back. What if the frail old couple everyone scorns were once the most powerful figures in the city? What if their final chapter was not one of fading away, but of a triumphant, earth-shaking return? Standing on the steps of the courthouse, free in every sense of the word, Arthur and Eleanor Vance watched their granddaughter, Chloe, laugh in the sunlight. Their long winter was over. The architects had built one last thing, a future for the one they loved. And it was built to last.